Hello, I'm Bruce DePoy. Coming up today on News Talk, here we go again. New reports suggesting Congress may not be able to reach an agreement to keep the government funded, and that we could see federal agencies run out of money again at the end of the month. Also, Europe strains under the weight of the worst refugee crisis the globe has seen since World War II. How much should the West do to help those fleeing horror and bloodshed? We'll put these questions and others to Maryland Congressman and U.S. Senate hopeful Chris Van Hollen. Then, preparing for the Pope, the Washington region makes plans for a papal visit expected to draw hundreds of thousands. WAMU 88.5 reporter Martin DeCaro on how metro and local governments are getting ready for the Pope's visit.
From News Channel 8, this is News Talk with Bruce DePoy.
We have such a great lineup for you this time. Hello, everybody. Thanks for watching. We appreciate you making us part of your day. We begin with the latest workplace worry for federal government workers. Fear that the government will run out of money at the end of the month. Maryland Congressman Chris Van Hollen is here. He's a Democrat from the 8th District. This is the first of several issues we'll be discussing today with him. Welcome back.
Good to be with you.
Good to have you. Thanks very much for your time, as always.
Great.
Here's how the Washington Post pegs the likelihood that we will go over the abyss again, Congressman. The government needs to be funded by September 30th, but Congress is way behind in passing the series of spending bills necessary to pass a full budget. Instead, lawmakers will probably try to pass a short-term budget extension that basically keeps spending levels the same as last year and keeps the government open. Even that's going to be tough. Lawmakers on both sides of the aisle are using the budget process to push their ideological agendas on everything from abortion to military spending to international nuclear deals. And there's a presidential campaign going on, complicating the decisions and actions of the 5 senators running for the White House. Those odds have only increased Congress's first week back. Of the 4 congressional budget analysts we consulted, the most conservative estimate was a well over 50% chance of a shutdown lasting a few days' time. Congressman Van Hollen, your reaction?
Unfortunately, I think that's a fair assessment, which is why I introduced the Preventing the Government Shutdown Act the other day, where we're asking Speaker Boehner and others to come to the table immediately to work out an agreement. And if he doesn't do it under the legislation, we would continue funding the government at the kind of investments we need to make sure the economy continues to grow. It would be an absolute scandal if Ted Cruz and his Tea Party colleagues shut down the government again. 2 years ago, they did it to try and shut down the Affordable Care Act, to shut down Obamacare. This time around, they're threatening to shut down the government in order to defund women's health programs like Planned Parenthood. I hope Speaker Boehner and cooler heads will prevail. But it looks right now like it's Ted Cruz who's in control, not Speaker Boehner.
The GOP leadership is in a real, they're being squeezed from all sides. They know from recent history, and of course, just because things played out a certain way in the past doesn't mean they will in the future. But if you look back over the last few years, the last couple times we've gone down this road, Congress has taken the hit in terms of public perception when the gears of government get so bogged down that federal workers are told stay home when the government basically shuts down. So as we get into this election cycle and there's this attention being paid to public perception, the last thing most Republicans want is to be tagged with another sign of dysfunction like a government shutdown. But he's got a certain element in the GOP caucus that feels like this is the moment to get stuff done. So do you
look, I don't feel too sorry for him because the answer is work with Democrats, work on a bipartisan basis to get this done. For months, we've been asking Speaker Boehner and the Republicans to come to the table and work something out. You know, 2 years ago, we were finally able to work out a budget agreement. It was called the Ryan Murray Budget Agreement Compromise. I was part of those discussions. Unfortunately, 2 years ago, the Republican leadership didn't wake up until after the government shutdown. So this time we're saying, let's learn from your mistakes in the past. Let's get this done before we go over the cliff. But it's been radio silence. We've heard nothing from the Republican leadership, and of course you need to negotiate. So they're the ones that are allowing themselves to be led around by the nose by Senator Cruz and others who are all using the Senate as a stage for their presidential ambitions.
Are there moderates in your chamber and or in the Senate who get it and who, given the opportunity to have something closer to regular order, would leap at the opportunity?
Well, this is just common sense. I mean, this is just making sure that we have the funds available to carry on the basic functions of government and do so at levels that we need to help support our economy. I mean, the President's budget and the budget I have offered on behalf of my colleagues would increase the investments we make at places like the National Institutes of Health to try and discover new treatments and cures for diseases, invest in other important areas like education, and make sure we invest in a strong national security. You know, Republicans right now are threatening to shut down the government over unrelated issues like funding for women's health programs and Planned Parenthood. That's a big mistake.
How much of the so-called Planned Parenthood videos have you seen? And do you take the view that these are heavily edited, we don't know what was really said in totality and in context, therefore it's tough to make a decision? Or can you say, based on snippets and clips and perhaps heavily edited excerpts, that what happened in those conversations was of at least some concern?
Well, I've not seen the videos, but I've read lots of independent analysis of it, and the verdict seems to be that they were heavily manipulated, that they were sort of fraudulently reframed to tell an untrue story. And so what's happened is this has whipped up a lot of people on the right who are now saying, let's shut down the government over this. The reality is, if they continue to pursue that ideological agenda, they're going to be taking the government over a cliff, and I think that will be a big mistake for the country, and I think it will also be bad for them, but it's going to be bad for the country, and it creates huge disruptions. And by the way, last time they shut down the government, it cost our economy $24 billion. That was for 16 days, 120,000 jobs lost. So this is a real hit if they continue down this path.
I don't want to get too into the weeds in terms of how the federal budget process works, but we hear talk about the sequester, cuts, and I guess there's a White House belief that to be making what they would call investments in things that are good for the country and would grow the economy, it's time we take those handcuffs off. Can you give us the sort of the sequester cuts 101 version of
right? And the president's absolutely right. The White House is right about this. What's happened is that because of the very tight, arbitrary caps that were put on investments in things like NIH and medical research or Head Start programs, the reality is that it is slowing down the economy in the next couple of years, according to the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office. It also means that we're shortchanging important investments in our future. After all, the Chinese are trying to copy our very successful model of investing in basic scientific research. And you have more and more American scientists that are finding opportunities in China when we want these people pursuing those opportunities right here at home. So it is incredibly short-sighted to shortchange these important investments, which is why the proposal I put forward to prevent the government shutdown would have as its default going to the funding levels called for in the President's budget and my budget for the coming year.
We are so far behind in terms of highway and bridge infrastructure. We have crumbling roads and bridges, and the backlog is large and it's growing every day. Finding the money to fix that would be great for our transportation system, and it would mean a real boost in terms of jobs. We now have Memorial Bridge that is partially closed because it's been allowed to fall into disrepair and the funds to fix it haven't been there. Do your colleagues understand how wrong this is on so many levels, or are they in such a SUV, chauffeur-driven bubble that they literally don't get it? I mean, I can't explain it either way, but I'm curious to know what it is that has brought us to this moment.
Look, you now have a significant number of House Republican members of the Tea Party caucus who don't believe in any significant federal role in the area of investing in our national infrastructure. They say, let's just kick all off that to the states. Forget about the fact that President Eisenhower was the father of the national highway system. I mean, their view is that this is just a state responsibility, when in fact you obviously have huge national projects of national significance, and we've got to modernize our infrastructure if we're going to compete globally. This is not something just to leave to the states. I put forward a proposal just about a month ago it's called the Grow America Act. It invests significantly in our infrastructure. It's a 6-year plan, and you fund the first 2 years by getting rid of some of these really perverse tax breaks that allow corporations to simply move their mailing address overseas and escape their responsibility to American taxpayers. In other words, they're benefiting from the infrastructure we do have, the investments that we do have here, and yet they don't want to pay a penny to help make that happen.
And how that's even legal, I can't imagine it. I mean, I guess to a certain extent we have that locally, where a lot of companies, correct me if I'm wrong, have a P.O. box in Delaware, but they exist in bricks and mortar terms elsewhere to carve out some kind of an advantage. And I guess what you're describing is a version of that.
It's something called inversions, which is a sort of fancy name for this loophole. I've introduced legislation to close this loophole. It would generate $40 billion that we could then use to invest in our infrastructure right here at home, modernizing our transit systems, our road systems, really important stuff.
Can you talk, Congressman, I want to shift overseas and talk about what is clearly the worst refugee crisis that the globe has seen since World War II. Can you talk about what the West is doing, what Europe and the U.S. and other nations are doing now to help people who are in as desperate a situation as I think, I mean, it's painful to watch, and I think a lot of folks are hoping that through our governments and our NGOs we step up. How much are we doing now? You were born abroad. Your dad was in the Foreign Service.
Yeah.
What are we doing now? How much more could we be doing?
I do think we can be doing more than we are now. In fact, I joined some of my colleagues in writing to the President, urging him to go beyond the 10,000 refugees that he says we can now take in. Look, you have an upcoming gathering at the United Nations. I think this is the moment when nations need to come together and say that we're going to work together to help address this global humanitarian crisis. And the United States should pledge to take more refugees than we have, as should those in Europe who are very also close to the scene of the crisis. And those countries, some of the Gulf states, if they're not going to be taking refugees, they should be providing financial support to help others shoulder the costs.
Lots for everyone to do. This is a very, very grim moment.
It is.
Talking with Maryland Congressman and U.S. Senate hopeful Chris Van Hollen. We'll take a quick break here. We're back, though, with much more on this Tuesday, right after this.